Call sat at the small kitchen table staring into an empty cup the coffee had long gone cold, but he still held it, his fingers curling around the ceramic, as if the answer to whatever was haunting him lay somewhere within its ridges. The dim light of cast a muted glow highlighting the tired lines on his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the slight furrow of his brow. He had always been a man in motion, never still, never quiet, never hesitant, and yet tonight he was all of those things from the doorway. Watched him, I had no reason to be standing there, lingering like some silent observer in a life that didn't belong to me. And yet I couldn't bring myself to move to turn away from the tension, thick enough to settle in my lungs. Kyle had changed not in an obvious, dramatic way. No, the change in him was quieter, creeping in at the edges of who he used to be. I noticed it in the way his fingers hesitated before unlocking his phone and how his jaw tightened when Monica's name appeared on the screen in the deep sighs. He exhaled when he thought no one was listening. Monica was slipping away from him, and I wasn't sure if he was more afraid of losing her or admitting that he already had. But night was different. He hadn't spoken since I arrived, hadn't touched. The food sitting on his plate hadn't responded when I'd asked if he was okay. I knew that look, it wasn't just exhaustion, it was something heavier. Something that sat behind his ribs like a doke. Something that wasn't leaving anytime soon. I hesitated before. Stepping forward, my breath slow measured, I was careful with my movements, careful with my presence. I placed my hand lightly on his shoulder, a touch that wasn't meant to linger, wasn't meant to say anything except, "I'm here." His body tensed for a brief second, a sharp inhale, but then his breath deepened beneath my palm, and I felt the subtle way his shoulders dropped, how the tension that had been wound tight within him unraveled just slightly. I shouldn't have touched him, and yet I didn't pull away. Let my fingers rest there. Let my warmth seep into his skin. Let Thessalance stretch between us like something delicate, something breakable, when I finally made the move to step back to retreat. Before I did something, stupid Call turned his head suddenly. Our faces were too close. His eyes found mine, and I forgot how to breathe some things. Wham there in the depth of his gaze. Something unspoken. Something raw. Grief-longing. Maybe even guilt before I could step away. Before I could say something that would snap us both out of whatever. This was, he moved. The kiss was barely a whisper. The press of his lips against, mine so soft, so hesitant, that for a split second, I could have convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. But it had, because I could feel the warmth off his breath as he exhaled against my skin. I could feel the way his fingers brushed against my wrist, how they lingered there, hovering between holding on and letting go. Then as quickly as it happened, it was over. Kyle pulled back his eyes, searching mine, waiting. Maybe for me to say something, maybe for me to pretend. It hadn't happened. A sharp inhale. Then silence. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us dared to name what had just passed. Between us, I should have stepped away. I should have left the kitchen given him space, pretended that moment hadn't settled into my chest like something dangerous, something I would never be able to forget. But I didn't, and neither did he. The air between us felt charged. Electric in a way that made my pulse quicken, my lips still, tingled from where had been my body acutely aware of the space between us, the space that felt entirely too small. I forced myself to take a breath, to study the racing thoughts that had to take shape in my mind. This wasn't supposed to happen, not like this. Kyle swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing slightly, as he exhaled a slow breath, his hand clenched into a fist on the table before he finally spoke. Voice rough, strained. "I shouldn't have done that." His words should have settled something inside me, should have pushed me away, should have reminded me of all the reasons why this was a mistake. Instead, they made my stomach tighten. Because if he was apologizing, if he was regretting it, then that meant it meant something. and that terrified me more than anything. I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. Kyle, he looked at me, then really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw it, the crack in his resolve, the way his hands twitched slightly, as if resisting the urge to reach for me again. Something inside me fractured. I should have left. I should have broken the moment before it could go any further. But neither of us moved, neither of us broke the silence in that silence. It was deafening that evening. Monica returned home later than usual. The air shifted the moment she stepped inside, thick with something neither of them acknowledged. I was in the kitchen, pretending to clean, pretending not to listen, as she sat down her bag with the same carelessness she always did these days. Kyle was still at the table, still gripping that empty coffee cup. His knuckles around the ceramic. Where were you? His voice was low, even, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Monica sighed, barely glancing at him. Work ran late, again. She turned, then something, flickering in her expression. Annoyance, maybe, or something else she didn't want him to see. Yes, Kyle again. I could feel the tension tightening between them, like a live wire. I scrubbed a plate that didn't need, scrubbing, my hands shaking, just slightly, waiting for the inevitable. He didn't look away from her. You didn't answer my texts. Monica rolled her eyes, kicking off her heels with deliberate movements. God, Kyle, I was busy. Do I need to report to you every second of my day? The plate in my hands nearly slipped away. She said it sharp, dismissive like. He was nothing more than an inconvenience. Kyle's jaw tightened. But he didn't snap back, didn't give her what she wanted. Instead, he just sat there watching, her with something unreadable in his expression. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Then he asked too quietly, Are you seeing someone? Monica stilled for a moment, just a fraction of a second. I saw something cross her face, something too quick to name. Then she scoffed, turning away from him. I'm not doing this right now. Kyle stood, pushing the chair back, roughly. No, you never do. You just come home late, avoid my calls, and pretend like nothing's changed. She grabbed a water bottle from the counter, twisting the cap with more force than necessary. Maybe nothing's changed. Maybe you're just looking for something to be wrong. Kyle let out a short, bitter laugh. Right, because I'm imagining all of it. Monica didn't respond. She just took a long sip of water, avoiding his gaze, avoiding the weight of the truth hanging in between them. Then she set the bottle down and walked past him. Kyle stood there for a long time. After she disappeared into the bedroom, his hands were braced against the table, his head bowed as if the weight of everything had finally settled onto his shoulders. It swallowed hard, my pulse thawing in my ears. I should have left, should have given him space, but my feet wouldn't move. He turned suddenly and our eyes met. I didn't think I just moved before. I could second-guess myself. I stepped forward, reaching out my hand, grazing his arm. His skin was warm beneath my touch, his muscles tense. He didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned into it. His fingers found my wrist, holding it lightly. His grip uncertain, but not reluctant. The breath between us was shallow, uneven, charged with something we weren't ready to name. I didn't know who moved first. Second, we were just standing there, barely touching the next. My back was against the kitchen counter and Kyle's lips were on mine. It was different. This time not a hesitant brush, not an accident waiting to be dismissed. This was deliberate. His hands pressed into my waist, fingers tightening just enough to make my skin burn beneath his touch. My own hands found his shirt, twisting into the fabric, anchoring myself to him, to whatever we were allowing to happen between us. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, and something deeper, something warmer. His lips were firm, certain, parting just enough to let me feel the weight of his breath, the warmth of his mouth against mine. I let myself sink into it, into him, into the way. His body pressed against mine as if he needed this as badly as I did. Then footsteps, we broke apart, just as Monica's voice called out. From the hallway, KY stepped back, his breathing, and even his fingers still curled against my wrist before he let go. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter, my heart slamming against my ribs. Monica appeared in the doorway, hair tied back, makeup smudged. At the corners, she looked between us, eyes narrowing slightly. But if she noticed anything, she didn't say. I'm going out, she said flatly. Don't, wait up. Kyle didn't respond. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his fists clenching. At his sides, the front door closed behind her. A moment later, the house exhaled in her absence. Kyle's hands found the edge of the counter, his head dropping forward. I could hear his breathing, steady but heavy, like he was trying to hold something and trying to keep himself from breaking. Completely, I should have left. I should have walked away before this got worse, before the weight of what we had done settled into something permanent, something neither Ophis could undo. But instead, I reached for him. My fingers traced the curve of his cheek, light, hesitant. He turned into my touch, just barely, his breath hitching slightly at the contact. I don't, his voice broke, his eyes closing. I don't know what I'm doing. Neither did I. But I knew I wasn't letting go. Kyle didn't move for a long time after Monica left. The sound of the door shutting had sent a strange finality through the house, like something had been severed, like themament before had solidified into something we couldn't undo. I watched him standing there with his hands braced against the counter, his head down, his breath coming too slowly, too deliberately. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't know where to start. Instead, I reached for him again. My fingers traced along his forearm, barely touching, just a whisper of contact, but he felt it, I knew, because his breathing changed, because his shoulders tensed. Before exhaling, because his handshaking uncertain, covered mine. His grip tightened, not harsh, not demanding, but grounding. His fingers curled over mine, pressing into my palm, like he was holding on to something real in a moment where everything else felt like it was slipping. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were darker than before. He looked exhausted. But beneath that, there was something else, something raw. I don't want to be alone. He murmured the words, so quiet I almost missed them. I swallowed hard. You're not. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my wrists, in every place his skin met mine. And then he moved, not rushed, not desperate, just inevitable. His arm slid around my waist, pulling me against him, and I let him. My hands found the back of his neck, my fingers threading into his hair, and I felt the way he exhaled in tune like this. This was what he had been, holding back for too long. His lips met mine again. And this time there was no hesitation. The kiss was slow but deep, his mouth parting against mine, his fingers pressing into the small of my back. The counter dug into my hips, but I didn't care, didn't notice anything beyond the warmth of his body against mine, the way he touched me like he needed this more than air. I didn't think about Monica. I didn't think about the consequences, about what this meant, about what would happen. When the moment ended, all I could think about was the way his hand slid under the hem of my shirt, his palm, skimming my skin like he wanted to memorize every inch of me. I gasped into his mouth, and that sound, small and voluntary, sent something breaking between us. KY groaned softly, his grip tightening, and suddenly we were moving. His hands lifted me effortlessly, and I wrapped my legs around his waist as he carried me out of the kitchen, down the hallway. I barely registered where we were going until my back met theme mattress, his weight pressing into me, surrounding me. The room was dim, the only light coming from the hallway. Shadows stretched along the walls, flickering and shifting as we moved. Kyle hovered above me, his breath Uneven, his forehead pressed against. Mine, his fingers traced my cheek, then my jaw, then lower, dragging down my throat, slow and deliberate. I shivered beneath his touch. "I shouldn't want this," he whispered. "Neither should I, but I did." I reached up my fingers, brushing his lips, tracing the shape of his mouth, before pulling him back down to me. His body fit against mine like he'd been meant to, be there all along. Kyle's breath was warm against my skin, his hands, careful but wanting tracing paths along my body like he was trying to remember every inch of me. I arched into him, feeling the heat of his weight, pressing me deeper into the mattress, and, for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking. Not about Monica. Not about what this meant. Not about the lines we had crossed, just this. Just the way his lips moved against mine. The way his fingers slid beneath the fabric of my shirt. The slow press of his hips against me. He kissed me like he had been waiting for this. Like he had thought about it more times than he would ever admit. There was a hunger in the way his hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, anchoring me against him. My fingers slipped into his hair, tugging, just enough to pull a soft groan from his lips, and the sound sent a rush of heat down my spine. I wanted this pulled back, just enough to look at me, his breathing uneven. His fingers hovered at the hem of my shirt, waiting. Hesitating, his eyes searched mine, and I knew. He was giving me a choice and out, but I didn't want one. I reached for his hands, guiding them higher, pulling the fabric up and over my head, letting it fall somewhere forgotten. His eyes darkened, his fingers skimming the newly exposed skin with a touch, so reverent it made my stomach tighten. He kissed me, again slower this time, like he wanted to savor it, like he wanted to memorize the taste of me. I sighed into his mouth, my body pressing up against his, and I could feel how much he wanted this too. Somewhere in the back of my mind I knew. This was dangerous, that once we crossed this line, there would be no going back. But with Kyle's hands on me, his lips trailing down my neck, his breath uneven as he whispered my name, I didn't care. I let myself get lost in him, in the warmth of his skin, in the way his fingers traced patterns along my ribs. I let myself sink into the moment, into the way he looked at me like I was something he'd been aching for. The world outside didn't exist. Nothing existed but this.